Calling, 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 calling. Call the Growthbusters. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
From the Institute for Advanced Growth Addiction Studies, welcome to the Growthbusters podcast. Here, we discuss our society's addiction to growth, and we do our best to chart a sustainable course for human civilization. On a full planet, that means it's time we stop expanding the scale of the human enterprise. We're talking about both our numbers and the size of our economy. In today's episode, does reducing child tax credits to encourage smaller families fall into the category of coercive public policy? Would it be good for your city to be the winner in the Amazon headquarters sweepstakes? And what about environmental leaders? Are they walking the talk? With special guest Josh Spodek, author of Leadership Step by Step. Well, I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growthbusters, Hooked on Growth, and chief scientist at the Institute for Advanced Growth Addiction Studies. As always, for cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org. My two co-hosts have just finished strapping on their Proton Energy growth-busting backpacks, and they are ready to go.
I'm Caitlin Hickman.
Hi, and I'm Ben Bacher, Assistant Growthbusters.
Well, let's start with this follow-up. A couple of episodes ago, we talked at length about public policy prescriptions to try to move us toward smaller families. Is it moral? Is it ethical for governments, public agencies to try to do something to influence how many children we decide to conceive? And one of the questions that came up, we talked a little bit about tax policy. And of course, here in the United States particularly, we're quite familiar with that, where we have child tax credits and we have income tax deductions for dependents. And both of those seem to provide a financial incentive for you to conceive more children, to have a bigger family. And so obviously our thinking turned to the idea of, well, should we maybe back off on those a little bit in order to provide less of a financial incentive to have big families? And I think, Caitlin, I don't know that you said that's a bad idea, but you did feel like we should categorize that as coercive.
Yeah, I think any type of financial incentive is somewhat coercive, but and I thought it fell under Travis Reeder's definition of coercive, but yeah, not necessarily a bad thing. I think it just depends on the specific.
Well, and I think it's interesting, especially with the taxes as a pretty big issue in Congress right now. And I didn't know if they're in Trump's tax plan, if there was anything on child credits, but supposedly they think that that might be a part of the new tax plan, that they're going to cut some child tax credits, and that's kind of a big issue for some people. Actually,
I thought I read that they were thinking about increasing them.
Were they really? Interesting.
Yeah. So I thought, well, if they were, that would be a reason that I would want to get involved a little bit, because I don't think that's a good idea.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But we decided to turn to the experts because we had been talking about this philosophy professor and bioethicist Travis Reeder, who has worked with Colin Hickey and Jake Earl. They wrote a paper called Population Engineering and the Fight Against Climate Change. And in that paper, they kind of wrestled with these ideas about public policy prescriptions.
Mm-hmm.
So these guys have really wrestled with it, and they wrote a great paper, and we'll include a link to that paper in the show notes for this podcast. But we decided, well, let's call them up and see what they say about child tax credits and whether tweaking those is in fact coercive. So I checked in with Travis Reeder about this, and he wrote an answer, which I want to share with you guys. Here's what he wrote. It's a good question. I can't speak for Colin and Jake, but I'm guessing that they would agree with me on the following. The question isn't whether adjustments would be coercive. They clearly wouldn't be, but that's just because coercive is a technical term, meaning an action or policy that eliminates or virtually eliminates choice.
Mm-hmm.
And a financial incentive or disincentive doesn't
right.
eliminate
right.
choice,
Yeah.
but it does influence the choice. Continuing with what Travis wrote. Now, positive incentives that are sufficiently large can start to risk coercion by offering undue inducement. by making it almost impossible to rationally deliberate. Think about offering the desperately poor person $50,000 for having a vasectomy. That would be almost like an offer you couldn't refuse if you were desperately poor. That takes that financial preference kind of incentive and pushes it kind of into the coercion category, at least according to the thoughts of these philosophers on this. But aside from that, we tend not to think that taking away some incentive is potentially coercive. But that doesn't mean that it's permissible. Not all non-coercive things can be morally justified. So one worry about taking away the child tax credit completely is that it would disproportionately affect the children of the poor, and that would be unjust. So personally, I don't think we ought to eliminate the child tax credit, but I think it ought to be much more progressive. As of now, it phases out around $110,000 in income per year for a couple's first child. But a family making that does not need that credit in order for their child to avoid suffering. The credit seems most appropriate to me at the level of genuine hardship, such that the child suffers through no fault of her own for having been born to parents who cannot adequately care for her. But giving the credit to parents who earn more than that is simply rewarding people for having children, which is unacceptably pro-natalist, I think. Those were Travis Reeder's words. So what do you think about that?
I think I think I would agree with that, and I think that's kind of somewhat similar to something we somewhat agreed on in the episode where we talked about that, like some kind of a sliding scale where it gets like slowly disincentivized the wealthier you are.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Yeah, I agree that makes a lot of sense. In fact, that's an easy one, is to say, forget it at those higher income levels. I still struggle with the reality out there is that there are people who are at or below poverty level today who actually do conceive children in order to get more government assistance, unfortunately.
Really?
Yeah, it is a fact. It's a sad fact.
Well, I'm just interested in your sources.
Well, and that's the deal. I don't think there's any study out there that shows it, but I have talked time and time again to people who work in the welfare system and work with disadvantaged families, and so there's tons of anecdotal evidence about that.
Interesting.
They say, oh yeah, they talk freely about that. Have a baby, get a check. And of course, that's, we can't generalize that and say that would apply to everyone. There's just some subset of the population that really does look at it that way. And it's really kind of sad because chances are if they did the full math on that, they would find that they probably aren't making a profit.
Right.
It's definitely not. Yeah, I wonder how many people that is. Even if that's true for some people, I worry that might be, like you just said, we can't generalize. So I know that you know this, but it's dangerous to propagate those ideas that poor people, I don't know. I feel like that just fits into the popular American mythology about welfare and
gaming the system.
Right? Yeah.
Well, we have to be honest. There are people who game the system, but it's dangerous to assume that the vast majority of them do. And I think the conversation and the policy debate around the dependent deductions and child tax credit would be really similar to other welfare questions, which is if you can't completely eliminate the abuse of the system, does that mean you do away with the system? Because there are definitely people out there who genuinely need the assistance.
Right. Yeah. And I believe that those people are in the majority. So I believe in the system in that regard.
I hope you're right, but I wish we could figure out a way to eliminate the abuse and eliminate, somehow find a way to really greatly reduce the number of people who would just conceive children just in order to get financial assistance. Because one, that certainly doesn't help us much with overpopulation, but that's really not a good way to decide to become a parent. I mean, I wouldn't want to be born to a family who had me just because they wanted the money. I would want to be born to parents who really wanted a child and wanted to love the child, that I wasn't a check to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder if there's a way to quantify that. I don't know.
I was pretty sure we weren't going to come up with the answer to that, but I thought it would be good to just sort of raise that question and leave that hanging out there. Sometime in the future we might stumble across someone who's got some good thinking on that. Who knows?
Well, and I looked up you were right about the tax plan. It's planned to increase the child tax credit, but specifically it's doing the exact opposite of what Travis Reeder proposes. It's increasing the child tax credit, but it's increasing the upper limits of how much you can be earning.
Oh my gosh.
So it's not helping those lower class families at all. It's only helping it. Yeah, now I'm not sure what the proposed higher limit is now, but it's just ridiculous.
Gee, I wonder why. What is it? What is it about the current administration that would make it want to help the rich?
I just don't get it, because it says the lowest tax bracket is going to increase. Like the lowest tax rate is going to increase, and I just don't understand. I don't know how
that can be justified.
Yeah, right. Like how, if you're one of those working class families, you can think that it's good for you that your tax rate is going up, whereas the wealthiest, it's getting cut. I don't understand. I wish someone could explain that to me, because a lot of people do feel that way. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's a lot of propaganda, like really, really persuasive propaganda, and just different educations that don't overlap. Like I just think the things that I've been taught are really
and also maybe if you think one day you're going to be in that top tax bracket, like you're just
American
temporarily
dream.
poor.
Yeah, but there's also just something to the spin that, there are people out there apparently who will just believe that little nugget that somebody tweeted this morning, that has no veracity whatsoever. But if the president tweeted it, and it's what you wanted to hear, then you're going to believe it, even though the truth might be completely the opposite. So moving right along, why don't we talk a little bit about the Amazon headquarters sweepstakes? But I really am curious, Caitlin, when I offered this up as a potential agenda item, you indicated that you were very interested in talking about this. So I really would love to hear your thoughts. And basically what we're talking about is the deadline passed in October for proposals from cities to be the site of a second Amazon headquarters, complete with a $5 billion promised investment by Amazon, also the promise of 50,000 high-paying jobs. So before I pontificate, what were your initial thoughts on that?
I just think that's an interesting story, because it makes sense to me that is a thing that people want, like the promise of jobs. I don't know. Yeah, it speaks to a lot of desperation right now for more jobs and for like higher tech cities. And I don't know. Yeah.
Job creation. I mean, that is every politician throws that out. Promises jobs, job creation. You could say, let's start World War III. It's going to create jobs. And everybody would say, okay. Who can be against jobs?
But it's also interesting, I thought, in the article you wrote talking about Denver, how companies are having trouble finding workers because the unemployment rate is actually so low.
Right.
I don't know. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and it was interesting to me that Denver, so strongly wanted to host the new Amazon headquarters, just because I think it's such a cool city. I don't know. I just feel like it doesn't need to grow that much more. Like I don't want it to become huge. But it's interesting that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you guys, quickly got that, because you're, there's no secret to the fact that you're young and fairly new Growthbusters. And, I've been busting growth for over a decade. So I've seen what cities do. I've really seen firsthand here at the Institute for Advanced Growth Addiction Studies, which you guys know is a joke. But in a way, that is what Growthbusters is, really. But I've watched that cities just cannot resist, and that they measure their success by how fast they're growing.
Right.
And, of course, the economic development industry in every community, which is really the people who profit from growth. It's the home builders, the real estate developers, the bankers who loan money for construction projects and mortgages, and construction companies and media companies who benefit from having more viewers of their television stations, more subscribers to their newspapers. Those guys all profit from growth. And so they're constantly pushing communities to provide financial incentives to poach companies from other areas of the country, to get companies to move to their community. And propaganda and the spin about it is, well, that's job creation. And, we need jobs. We need more jobs. We need better jobs. And if we seem to have enough jobs, then we don't have the right kind of jobs. And
Right.
Colorado Springs is a pretty good example of that, where we've got, this really remarkably low unemployment rate. And so what happens is now they decide, well, let's wring our hands about not having enough millennials. Maybe we have low unemployment, but we're not keeping millennials here in town. We're not interesting enough. We're not vibrant enough. We've got to do something to keep those young innovators in town. And the truth is that statistically, Colorado Springs isn't doing bad in that department either.
Right. Well,
but the economic developers want you to think we are.
And I feel like that of like we have enough jobs, but we need better jobs is kind of like a thinly veiled excuse for gentrification. Just because you think of if Denver gets Amazon and 50,000 people come in, well, like what you said, of 4 or 5 of those 50,000 will be people who aren't from Denver originally. Like who are they gonna push out? Yeah, right.
Yeah,
because if they're making so much more money and they can afford to pay that much more rent, then
clean up cities and make,
Yeah, so the smart people, and there are some smart people who have actually spoken up against this. One of them was Diane Carman, who wrote a great opinion piece in the Denver Post and said, what problem are we trying to solve, and what problems do we have today that this is just going to make worse? And of course, Colorado, the biggest problems Denver faces are the traffic's a nightmare in town already. They cannot stay ahead of it. And then out of town, Interstate 70 heading west into the playground, into the mountain recreation areas, skiing in the wintertime and camping, hiking, fishing, et cetera, in the summertime. I-70 is a disaster, especially on weekends. Saturday mornings going up into the mountains, Sunday afternoons coming back. It's no fun whatsoever. And I think people kind of put their brain into neutral and they just sort of assume, well, there must be so much wealth that would be generated from having this big corporate headquarters in town that we would be able to solve those problems. This would bring us money to solve those problems. Or at the very least, we would stay even. We wouldn't get worse. And yet, Name one city that has managed to bring in corporate relocations and actually stay ahead of the game. In every case, as they grow their population, their traffic congestion gets worse. It never improves. They never make enough money to improve, just traffic congestion. And of course, I haven't even talked about air pollution and water supply. Colorado water supply is a huge issue. I mean, we got to be nuts to be hoping to add 50,000 new jobs to Denver. And of course, we skipped one important part about it. You kind of alluded to that, this 4 out of 5 deal, and that is that statistically, when you bring in a corporate relocation like that, it creates a labor employment shock. And what that does is that brings a lot of new job seekers to move to the area. And statistically, 4 out of 5 of those new jobs do not go to local residents. They go to new residents, people who moved into the area chasing those jobs. So it drives population growth. That means more people drinking your water, watering the lawns, clogging your freeways.
I wonder where all those people are coming from.
Everywhere. Well, they're definitely coming from places with higher unemployment rates. And that's why the late Al Bartlett, physics professor at the University of Colorado, talked about this frequently, that if you're bringing jobs into your community, you're actually increasing the number of unemployed people. Because over the long haul, it's kind of like water seeks its own level. And so the places in the country with higher unemployment rates, those people will eventually move to the places with more job opportunities. And so over the long haul, the unemployment rates are going to even out. And so that means you're going to have a bigger population, but you're going to end up, with more unemployed people.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you can't win that game, that whole job creation thing. It's a growth industry scam. Let's see. It's time for us to bring in our guest. So now we have on the line with us Joshua Spodek, who's host of a new podcast launching this fall, Leadership and the Environment, Beyond Talk to Action. Thanks for joining us today, Josh.
Glad to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
Tell us a little bit about the podcast. Where do you stand in the launch department?
Well, what's happening is that it's catching on more than I expected. And so I keep doing more and more interviews. I keep telling myself, all right, one more interview, and then I'll get into the real serious launch mode. Because people have had like 40 million TED Talk views and #1 best-selling authors and people with like really big names. And everything leads to more and more people. And I think partly because people see huge value in this, that I think I'm addressing something missing, that for a long time, we've had science, we've had education that's been telling us we've been sea levels, resource depletion, we know what's happening. And what people aren't doing is there's a lot of people saying, you change. Meanwhile, I'm not changing myself. And I'm saying, let's change ourselves. And it's, I think, what I call is leadership in the style of Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or Václav Havel. And I ask people to take on a personal challenge, and then time passes and I have them on a second time and I ask them how the challenge went. And some people, it's very successful. They just go through and it's like a breeze. It's like they make a change they never did before and they're like, wow, that was easy, that was fun. But more people are, wow, that was more of a challenge than I thought, but they stick with it. And you get this human side of things when they try to do something and they don't, but then they realize, but I really do care about this. And they redouble their efforts, or they bring their kids into it, or they bring their wife or husband into it. And there's this genuine, authentic leadership that happens by living by their values.
Back to the genesis of this, were you thinking, or were you afraid that leaders in the environmental arena were hypocrites and trying to get other people to change but not being willing to change? Or were you thinking that they were so busy focusing on system change and not realizing that individual action can play a big role in sustainability? What was it?
There's a whole bunch of things. I think one thing, a lot of them, their strategy is things like changing laws, which I support, but if you don't have popular support, it's tough to get that stuff through. And in the United States, people talk a lot about the environment, but if you look at their behavior, the price of gas drops and people are buying SUVs again. And so that's a big issue. I think getting the popular support will make the laws pass more. Certainly there are people who, I'm not going to call them hypocrites, but it hurts your credibility, or it makes it difficult to follow someone. Like, for me, a big thing was watching Leonardo DiCaprio's movie Before the Flood. And so I'm glad that he made the movie. I see all these things going on in the world, and he's flying all over to Java and to Antarctica and to north of the Arctic Circle and so forth.
Probably on a private jet, too. We don't know.
And so if I'm watching that and I don't know much about the environment, I think, well, maybe there's something to it. Maybe I should follow what he's doing. What is he doing? Well, he's flying all over the world. I guess I should fly all over the world too. And so I think that is, people are going to go with what you do more than what you say if they're in conflict. And I think that people were missing, one of the big things that started it for me was my experience changing my behavior. And I really thought the first one that made a really big effect on me was realizing how much garbage of mine came from food. And so I gave myself a challenge for 1 week to have no food where I had to throw away packaging afterwards. And it was a big challenge. And I won't lie that I went through 6 months, maybe a year of having really bland food because I didn't really know how to cook that well. And then I started realizing how to do it, how to cook well. And now my food's really delicious and I'm saving money. Yeah. Oh man, eating healthy is not expensive. Not knowing how to cook is expensive. Once you know how to cook, you get stuff from the farm. So I'm eating more variety than ever. And I wanted to get that across, that when you live by your values, your life is better. That's what value means. It's like what's better and what's worse. And so if you choose what for you is better, I'm not telling people what their challenge should be. They're picking it themselves. And when you get on the other side of it, people constantly tell me about this mindset shift that happens when you stop, what do I say? Choosing comfort and convenience because it's easier, and instead choosing what you really value. And people go through the same challenge. It's like, at first it's a struggle. It feels like deprivation and sacrifice. And then it stops being about what you're not doing and it becomes what you are doing. So when I'm not getting packaged food, I am getting fresh vegetables and fruit, which once my taste buds adjusted, has more flavor and more nuance and more complexity than the packaged stuff. Oh, I should also mention the systemic change. People talk about it, but to me, one of the most important changes that you're addressing, and almost no one else is the beliefs and the goals that are driving the system. And when I say to someone, here's one little tip that you can do to change your impact on the environment or something like that, to say one little tip implies the person doesn't want to do it. So you may get compliance on this one little thing, but you're reinforcing the belief driving the whole system, which is generally things like growth or, what I want, I should get, entitlement. So I feel like I'm addressing this issue of, I'm not saying this is something you don't want to do. I'm saying this is something you want to do, that you'll be glad you did it. You'll wish you had done it earlier.
what do you call it? You would call it the joy of living light on the planet.
Yeah, I think when most people, if you ask them, what do you think of when you think of changing behavior to affect the environment less, or to affect it more if you're improving it, is I think people think deprivation of sacrifice or guilt and blame or doom and gloom. And for me, it's by far delicious is the number one thing I think of, because food, that it came from changing my diet. And people who know me know, I mean, I invite people over all the time now. And I actually, if you look on my blog, you can find the food reviews of my friends. They're like, I never knew food could be this good. I didn't know it either.
So Ben and Caitlin, didn't I tell you were going to love this guy?
Yeah. I relate to that really, really strongly because, yeah, as I've gotten more and more into cooking local food and like getting to know more farmers, I've had some incredible meals, and it really, yeah, I don't always have as much time as I want to have to cook with whole foods, but when I do, it's so, so delicious and worth it.
Yeah, I have in front of me here in my hand is a bowl of soup that I made last night. I made yesterday afternoon. A friend came over. Normally we would have met at a restaurant, but instead she comes over to my place. We're cooking together. And what do I have in here? I got black beans, lima beans, squash, pumpkin, onion, water, salt, nutritional yeast. I forget what else is in there, but it's like, there's no filler. It's all delicious. Mm-hmm. And I never cooked this way before. I really like it. Sorry if I'm going on too long about the food. I mean, there's another big shift I made, which was to challenge myself to go for a year without flying when I found out that flying, how much it pollutes. Mm. And I consistently get this thing where most of the time when I tell people about this challenge, their first response is, oh yeah, it probably is easy for you, but you have to understand, for me, I have family all over the world and I have my job requires it and all this special snowflake stuff, that they're like, of course I know that. Everyone knows that because we all live like that. I mean, I don't know, not all, actually most people in the world do not live like that. And again, it was the same pattern that happened with the food, was that at first it seemed like deprivation, sacrifice, and I had to say no to a bunch of things. But I didn't replace it with sitting in the corner of my room staring at the wall. Mm-hmm. I like adventure. I like new cuisines. I like new cultures. And so what I learned is that you can create those things. And for most of human history, there was no flying at all. And those people weren't like sad all the time. They found ways to be happy, and so can I. And so it's like self-empowering. And that's, something I wanted to share.
So did you have good episode conversations with Al Gore and Leonardo DiCaprio then?
They haven't happened yet.
They need to.
Yeah. One person who has worked with Al Gore is putting me in touch, but he hasn't heard back from him. So we're still waiting on that one. DiCaprio, I've actually been put in touch with the DiCaprio Foundation. So edging closer there. But that's one of the things that keeps getting me toward the interviews, is just that the reception that I'm getting is, and part of it is I want to give the people that I interview the chance to look great, because if we're going to make it through the challenges ahead, and speaking in systemic terms, if we're going to avoid overshoot and collapse, okay, either we hit overshoot and collapse, in which case it doesn't matter, there's going to be bigger problems, or we're going to figure out a way out of it. And then the people who make these changes are going to look great. Like if I can get all the TED Talk audience people like Elon and Oprah and Sergey and Larry and people like that to get rid of their 737s and maybe get a smaller apartment or something like that, they're going to be the ones on the forefront of, the way I think of it is like there are a very few number of people who are like fathers or mothers of a nation, like Thomas Jefferson or Nelson Mandela. And they're going to be the fathers and mothers of a new way of doing things that I think if they don't do it, a lot of people are going to keep following what they are doing. But if they do it, people are going to follow this change and say, maybe it's time that we say enough is enough. Enough is more than enough, and we can be happy and enjoy what we have.
Yeah, this kind of circles back to, was it our last episode or 2 episodes ago that we talked about Prince William and Kate Middleton and their decision to have a third child, and the lost opportunity there, that they could have been role models and said, we've decided, the prince has decided to get a vasectomy. We've decided that we don't need to be adding more children. Smaller families are the environmentally responsible way to go. There's a lot of power in that. From those were our people who are sort of born leaders. The media is following them, so they could use the bully pulpit for good.
And enjoy it and look great as a result.
Yeah. They have no idea how much more
perspective.
fun life would be without having such a big brood to interrupt your nap every afternoon. Ben's laughing because we've had a lot of conversations about him possibly moving back in with his parents, and he's convinced that I don't ever want my children to move back. I must really hate my kids, and I love them dearly. But I did stop it too.
Yeah, they say absence makes the heart grow fonder. Although, actually, I want to address this point about everyone saying, I got family all over the world, therefore I have to travel. For one thing, that was born of a system that maybe in the past, before we did the research or we thought we had more time, maybe those goals worked with the world as we knew it then. But if we keep doing that, I mean, leadership means changing first or being people in the forefront of things. But another big thing is when I look at this stuff about visiting your family all over the world, it's like, oh, hi, Grandma, great to see you. Mwah, mwah, great to see you. Oh, so great to see you. Okay, bye. It seems to me a lot of it is a fast food version of relationships. If they're all over the world, you're not really spending time with them. And because we're traveling all over the place, because we rely on all this fossil fuel stuff, then we have families all over the place. And the change has to start somewhere. Or either it doesn't start, in which case, trouble. We all know the predictions. Or it starts, and again, you don't replace it with crying and just sitting in the corner of the room doing nothing. You replace it with building community and maybe having your family closer more of the time.
Well,
Why is your family all over the world?
That was partially my point, Josh, about considering, just because I'm a senior in college right now and just talking with all my friends, it's like, where are you going to be after graduation? And it's not even an option really to think about like staying at home or even living in the same town as your family. It's kind of an American thing. You just have to disperse after you graduate. And so I was just thinking about that as an option kind of just because I feel like that's a huge sustainable thing. If you don't have to go to a new house or a new city to just kind of be more localized.
Yeah, or fly home every Thanksgiving.
Right.
I don't know why they're looking all over the place anyway. I mean, start doing something. Or from my perspective, oh man, I teach at NYU, and students there, it's really easy to silence someone that you disagree with by saying they're entitled or privileged or something like that. And so the entire university, the main philosophy or ethos or the big value is traveling. And so all these people who have not a clue of how aerodynamics works, have no idea how a jet engine works or an internal combustion engine works, are quick to fly all over the world. They're going to like Kenya to help the Kenyans. But NYU is doing this big building thing. They're building all these buildings and they're trying to save costs as well. And then they send their students to Kenya to build a building. So either the students are good at building buildings, in which case you don't have to go to Kenya, you can build it here. Or they're not good at building buildings, in which case, why are you sending them to build buildings over there? And why not send a carpenter who's out of work here over there? Or for that matter, why don't you just teach them to do it over internet so that they can figure out how to do it themselves and not require us? And for that matter, why doesn't the student just take a subway ride to someone who can use the help here? I'm not saying don't help Kenyans, but is flying a bunch of people who aren't skilled at building to build something there? I think it's more for just call it travel.
Absolutely. I agree.
I don't think we're really thinking about what we want to get done here. It's just, people like to travel. If I could snap my fingers and appear in Kenya, I would do it. But I don't know how to do it. I mean, I don't know how to do it except with all the jet fuel. I asked people this
kayak over there, that would be.
Well, actually, I've been thinking lately about, like, when's the next time I'm going to go to Europe? Or when's the next time I'm going to go to Asia? Or whatever. What happens the more you do this is the more you start looking for other things. And for example, if you're not eating packaged food, you got to get what food is around. And in New York City, that means in the winter, like last winter is when it really came together. And I was getting things like turnips and rutabagas and parsnips and cabbage and stuff that I never bought before. And when I had people over, they're like, Josh, this is incredibly delicious. And it took like a couple of years to get there, but a couple of years of really increasingly delicious stuff. And I started thinking, maybe I'll sail across the Atlantic. I don't know how to do it, but I have a friend from high school and her husband he's like a big boating guy. And I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but even if it never happens, it's a very interesting thing that happens in your mind when you start thinking, what can I do? What is out there?
Yeah, that would be the trip of a lifetime.
Exactly. I mean, maybe I'll be puking over the side the whole time. I don't know. But it's just a really interesting thought of sailing across the Atlantic. I guess I'd have to find people to, I don't know how I'd do it. I haven't gotten to that stage yet. It was just like a shower thought this morning. But it's along the lines of, I mean, if I do it, people are going to be like, oh man, Josh did a really cool thing. And it's not going to be like, oh, he's missing out on the Eiffel Tower, he's missing out on Machu Picchu and stuff like that. Another thing that happened was, with not flying, I like adventure. I like meeting people from different cultures. And so this is a story I've told a few times, that one of my mentors, Frances Hesselbein, I teach and I coach leadership, and she won a Presidential Medal of Freedom for being the CEO of the Girl Scouts for more than a decade. And Peter Drucker called her the best leader in America. Okay. She was also born during World War I. And she is in New York City. And it occurred to me that if I want to meet people from different cultures, someone who lived through the Depression, through Prohibition, through World War II, through the Cold War, that person is as different from me culturally as most of the people I'm going to meet in my travels, especially because most people in their travels, they're on Facebook too. And so a lot of people, they go to Bangkok and they're talking to the people at the hotel or hostel that they could have talked to at their hometown. Anyway, so I go to talk to her and I say to her, I'm talking to people about changing their behavior, and to suggest to them not going to Machu Picchu is like an affront to them, and they get really angry. And I say, you were around during World War II. What was it like then? And she said, every man in my life served. She said, husband, brother, father, grandfather, they all served. And she talked about, and serving is not like not going to Machu Picchu. It's going to Iwo Jima and going to Normandy. And she talked about that. And after that, I said, okay, so that's what happened. And I hope I'm not getting too serious here. But I said, what was it like emotionally? What was the meaning like for people? And she said, it's just what we did. She didn't even think twice. It's just what we did. And to me, a couple things struck me about that. But one was, this is a really different culture. And it's the same country, different times, but very culturally different. And I wouldn't have had that experience had I not stayed. That's, to me, is like, if you want adventure, culture, more delicious, you can make that happen. I think mostly it's like we're taking what's handed to us by a system that's driven by growth and so forth, that I like the way I'm doing it now much more. And I wouldn't have expected it had I not lived it.
Well, I want to salute you for stepping outside the box. You're definitely asking questions that not very many people are asking, and exploring subjects that people haven't been exploring enough. So I hope we can hear a lot more from you about this kind of thinking. I didn't intend, it's just the experiences of, I didn't know that I'd, avoid packaged food would make my life so much better. But once it happened, people on my podcast, they keep saying I've had this mindset shift where I start looking forward to taking on more challenges as opposed to stopping. Because when you act by your values, on the other side of that challenge, on the other side of the struggle, is a better life. And it's not by my standards, but by the person's own standards. So Josh, can we pin you down on a launch date on when we can send them over to start listening to your podcast?
Yeah, the site isn't totally done. I apologize for how slow I'm doing this, but it's basically up. And if you go to joshuaspodek.com/podcast, there's at least the 0th episode, which is where I talk about the experiences that got it started for me.
And Joshua, I did not do you justice when I introduced you. So real quickly, why don't you share with us a little bit about who you are and what you do, so people will know you're not just some nutcase who decided to do this podcast.
Well, I mean, the main thing is so what do you do for a living is I teach and I coach leadership at NYU and Columbia, and entrepreneurship also. Actually, this semester I'm teaching a class in systems thinking as well. I have a book that came out earlier this year that's reached bestseller called Leadership Step by Step. And it's a book of exercises to do to become a better leader. And leader doesn't just mean someone in a suit telling people what to do. It's the social and emotional skills underneath it of empathy and compassion and listening and understanding and support. And as far as I know, every other book they're more of like history or leadership appreciation. And this is how to become a leader. And then going further back, I have a PhD in physics. I left academia to become an entrepreneur or to start a company, and then eventually went back to business school. And business school is where I started learning leadership, how to learn it. And then the past dozen years or so, I've been perfecting how to teach it more effectively. Oh, that's a quick thing. Oh, yeah. And I have all these daily habits. I can't help but share that I do burpees every day, and I've started them in December 2011. So I've done over 100,000 of them. And it's part of this daily habits thing that I do. And I write in my blog every day, joshuaspodek.com. And I've done that every day since January of 2011. And this kind of structure is like doing these little experiments or things that I've done that really, a lot of value in one's life.
Do you think the burpees or your blog is more important?
Oh, man. I mean, who do you like more, your mother or your father? I value them both greatly. I mean, one is more aesthetic and more about sharing ideas, and the other is more fit and healthy and more challenging, but they both give great reward.
Well, Joshua, we have to move to our last segment of the podcast, but because of the topic of your podcast, I think it'd be interesting for you to stick around for the conversation. Can you hang around for another 5 minutes while we do our last segment? And
yeah, I'd be happy to.
Chime in. Okay, what we always try to do is we do this segment called Lightening the Load, where we each share our tips, things that we're doing in our own life to lighten the load. And I think it's interesting. Sometimes I think they might bring joy, and sometimes we might have a hard time finding the joy in them. But most of the time, I think they're pretty joyful tips that we come up with. What do you guys think?
Yeah,
So
I think they're joyful.
So have you got something to share today?
Mm-hmm.
Who wants to go first?
I can go. So it's been getting cold in Colorado Springs, and I grew up totally like blasting the heat whenever it got cold in my house because my mom and I are both really cold people and we like to stay warm. And now that I'm a college kid and paying for my own heating and utilities bill, I have learned that it's not the end of the world to not turn the thermostat way, way up. And it's like a luxury that I can live without, and that blankets are wonderful things. And so are big winter sweaters. And yeah, that was a big revelation for me.
So the joy of sweaters and blankets and comforters.
Yeah.
And are you really liking that? That feels good?
Mm-hmm. It feels good. Yeah, I bought a used sweater 2 days ago, and yeah, it's fun and warm.
Sounds good. Ben, what have you got for us?
yeah, mine is one that some people might find gross, but yeah, a lot of mine are related to water. But when I go to the bathroom now and I just pee, I don't flush the toilet anymore because it's a tremendous waste of water.
Oh, I thought it was just because you're a 22-year-old male.
Nope, none of that. Yeah, just to save water. But yeah, it actually saves a huge amount of water and it doesn't really change anything.
Well, darn, you stole mine because that's something that my wife and I have started experimenting with.
Yeah.
And, we have people traipsing through here frequently because we've got this little podcast studio in the basement. So we've got a podcast co-op here in Colorado Springs, and people come in, 3 different city councilors come into our house every week to record podcasts. And so we're a little shy about having an unflushed toilet in the guest bathroom. So Ruth and I have come up with this system where if one of us is going to go, we sort of just check with the other one. We just yell, flush. And if the other one thinks they're going to be going fairly soon, so we're doubling up on flushes. Yeah. We haven't gotten to the point where we just let it mellow all day long, because I think Ruth she'd be a little uncomfortable with the idea that the mayor or somebody would come in and find an unflushed toilet. So we haven't gotten all the way there yet.
But it's interesting that it makes people so uncomfortable. I don't know.
And originally I thought, are we really doing that much by conserving water? Because water is a pretty renewable resource. It goes down the pipe and ends up in the river, and it ends up being pumped back into the system, and we use it again and again. So what difference does it make whether we use a lot of water or very little? Because we're not burning it up. But the truth is, it was pointed out to me that we are using energy in the water treatment plant and energy to deliver the water and filter the water, both treating the sewage and treating the new water supply. So that's an energy saving, if nothing else.
Well, there is some loss of water along the way.
Yeah, but it's there. It's still in the world.
Yeah, but well, this is a whole nother podcast episode. But I mean, groundwater is very different from water like runoff and everything.
Yeah. So, Josh, curious what you think about this. You've been very polite and quiet, too quiet. But I'm thinking this is one of those areas where you can lighten the load, but it's pretty hard to come up with any joy. What is the joy of not flushing the toilet? Well, I guess it's one less thing to do, and it saves you a little bit of money on your water bill. But I can't say that anybody's going to walk around saying, man, you have got to try this. This has just made my life fantastic.
Well, what I find is that it's this mindset shift that I talked about, that a lot of people say, here's a little tip for a little thing that you can do, and they say that little things add up to big things. And while I don't argue against that, I don't think that that's the main point. It's that what makes a difference is doing something. And when you do something and you find out that you like it, then you want to do it bigger the next time, and you want to do it bigger the next time, and you want to do it bigger the next time. So changing my food behavior not flying to me is bigger than the food thing. And then doing a podcast and where I'm asking people to change your behavior is bigger than the flying. And so whatever you do, once you get in that mindset shift, or your mind shifts, then you start looking for bigger things. Like if I suggest to someone, like if someone drinks and drives, and I don't say to them, maybe you should try drinkless driving Monday. I say never drink and drive. And it's just better not to do it. But you have to know that. And so the experience of what you start with, lightening the load in any way, leads you to lighten the loads in bigger ways and bigger ways and bigger ways. So to me, the detail of what you choose to do is secondary to that you actually do it.
Yeah, you're living your life every day. If you're sharing flushes day in and day out, then you're going to automatically start thinking of other ways to conserve water that are bigger. Next thing you know, you're ripping out your lawn.
And it also opens up to other people who you're sharing something authentic. Most people wouldn't share that, or they'd feel nervous sharing it. You probably did feel nervous sharing it. And I was interviewing someone on my podcast, and she was talking about how she washes plastic bags to reuse them. And I'm like, I do that too. I didn't know other people did that. I felt kind of embarrassed about it. So when someone shares something like that, other people can share whatever their thing is too.
All right. So next episode, we should see if we can't come up with the most embarrassing thing that we do.
That's my legacy.
That's great.
That's the most genuine and authentic. Call it that, and then it sounds great.
Well, I wish we weren't out of time, but we are. So we've got to wrap it up. So Joshua, thanks so much for sharing with us your thoughts, your crazy questions that more of us need to be asking. We appreciate it, and we hope you'll pop back in from time to time to give us a report on how it's going.
Thank you for creating and keeping this community going.
Thanks, Joshua.
Thank you.
Glad to do it. Well, don't forget to explore issues at growthbusters.org. Check out our analysis of pro-growth bias in the media at growthbiasbusted.org. And be sure and check out Conversation Earth, our other podcast, at conversationearth.org. And help us fund a third season there. Visit tinyurl.com/CE Season 3, the number 3, and help us get funding put together so that we can have a third season of Conversation Earth. It's time. Thanks a lot for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.